They told her no, over and over. Flight school wasn't for her kind. Too emotional, not built for combat. She watched from the sidelines, studied harder than anyone, waited for a chance. Then one day, chaos hit. A training flight spiraled out of control. Engine failure, smoke, a general trapped on board. The pilot froze. But she didn't. She jumped in, took the controls midair, and brought the bird down smooth and safe. When the dust cleared, all eyes turned to her. The woman they said didn't belong in the sky had just become the reason a general was still breathing. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If you enjoy stories that show how persistence and skill triumph over prejudice, consider subscribing for more content that reveals the extraordinary moments when everything changes. The morning sun cast sharp shadows across the pristine tarmac of Randolph Air Force Base when Second Lieutenant Rebecca Raven Matthews first approached the entrance to the United States Air Force pilot training program. At 0600 hours on March 15th, the Texas sky was crystal clear, painted in shades of orange and gold that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. But Matthews wasn't focused on the sunrise. Her attention was completely absorbed by the imposing complex of buildings that housed one of the most selective and demanding training programs in the American military. Randolph Air Force Base, known throughout the aviation community as the West Point of the Air, had been producing military pilots since 1931. Its red tile roofs and Spanish colonial revival architecture gave it the appearance of a prestigious university campus, but the similarity ended at aesthetics. This was where the Air Force transformed college graduates into combat pilots capable of operating the most sophisticated aircraft ever built, under conditions that separated exceptional individuals from everyone else. The pilot training program accepted fewer than 1,000 candidates annually from a pool of over 8,000 applicants. Those selected had demonstrated academic excellence, physical fitness, and leadership potential that placed them among the top 1% of their generation. But even acceptance into the program guaranteed nothing. Approximately 30% of candidates would be eliminated during the 50-week training curriculum that tested every aspect of their intellectual, physical, and emotional capabilities. Matthews had dreamed of becoming a military pilot since childhood, when her father's Air Force career had taken their family to bases around the world. She'd grown up watching F-16s and F-15s streak across foreign skies, understanding that the men and women flying those aircraft represented the pinnacle of military aviation. Her academic record at the Air Force Academy had been exceptional, graduating third in her class with a degree in aeronautical engineering and flight ratings in multiple civilian aircraft. But despite her qualifications, her application to pilot training had been rejected 3 times over the past 18 months. Each rejection had come with polite language about competitive selection processes and the need to gain additional experience before reapplying. The official explanations never explicitly mentioned her gender, but the subtext was clear to anyone familiar with military aviation culture. In 1995, combat exclusion policies still prevented women from flying fighter aircraft or serving in combat roles, though these restrictions were beginning to face political and legal challenges. The Air Force had opened some pilot positions to women, but institutional resistance remained strong among instructors and senior officers who questioned whether women possessed the physical and emotional characteristics necessary for combat aviation. Colonel James "Thunder" Harrison commanded the pilot training wing at Randolph, and his reputation for producing exceptional combat pilots was matched only by his skepticism about integrating women into roles traditionally reserved for men. Harrison had flown over 200 combat missions during his career, earning decorations that included the Distinguished Flying Cross and multiple air medals for actions that remained classified decades later. At 52, Colonel Harrison represented the old guard of military aviation, officers who had learned to fly when physical strength and aggressive instincts were considered essential for survival in aerial combat. His assessment of female candidates was influenced by personal experience in conflicts where hesitation or physical limitations could result in death for pilots and their wingmen. Lieutenant Matthews, Harrison said as she entered his office for what she hoped would be a different kind of interview. "I see you're applying for pilot training again. This is your 4th application in 18 months. His office reflected a career spent in military aviation, walls lined with photographs of aircraft he'd flown, unit patches from assignments around the world, and awards that spoke of exceptional performance under combat conditions. The desk was positioned to give him a clear view of the flight line, where T-37 and T-38 training aircraft were being prepared for the day's missions. "Yes, sir," Matthews replied, maintaining the military bearing that had been drilled into her during 4 years at the Air Force Academy. "I believe my qualifications have continued to improve, and I'm prepared to meet the challenges of pilot training." Harrison studied her personnel file, which contained academic achievements and flight ratings that would have guaranteed acceptance for most male candidates. Her scores on the Air Force Officer Qualifying Test were in the 98th percentile, while her performance at the Academy had earned recognition from instructors who praised her analytical thinking and leadership potential. "Your academic credentials are impressive," Harrison acknowledged. "Top scores in mathematics and physics, excellent performance on spatial orientation tests, and civilian flight experience that demonstrates basic competency. On paper, you meet all the requirements for pilot training." The qualifier hung in the air between them, indicating that his concerns went beyond academic achievement or test scores. Matthews had heard similar comments during her previous applications, always followed by explanations about the demanding nature of military aviation and the need for pilots who could handle stress, physical demands, and life-or-death decision-making. However, Harrison continued, setting down her file to look at her directly. "Pilot training isn't just about academic achievement or basic flying skills. We're preparing pilots for combat operations where physical strength, aggressive instincts, and emotional stability under extreme stress determine who lives and who dies." His assessment reflected genuinely held beliefs about the requirements for military aviation, shaped by decades of experience in conflicts where pilot performance determined mission success and survival. But it also revealed assumptions about gender differences that weren't necessarily supported by objective evidence. "The training environment is designed to eliminate candidates who can't handle the physical and emotional demands of combat aviation," Harrison explained. "We deliberately create stress situations that reveal weaknesses that might not appear under normal circumstances. Candidates who are too emotional, too cooperative, or too concerned about feelings rather than mission accomplishment don't survive the program." Matthews listened to his assessment while processing the implications of his word choices. Terms like emotional and cooperative were often used as coded language to justify exclusion of women from positions requiring what were perceived as masculine characteristics. "Sir, I understand that pilot training is demanding, and I'm prepared to meet whatever challenges the program presents. My flight experience and academy training have taught me to prioritize mission accomplishment over personal comfort." That's what every candidate says during their interview, Harrison replied with the skepticism born of experience. The difference between saying it and doing it becomes apparent when candidates face situations that test their limits. Combat aviation requires split-second decision-making, physical coordination under G-forces that would incapacitate most people, and the willingness to use violence to accomplish military objectives. He paused, studying her reaction to his increasingly direct assessment of the challenges she would face. Additionally, pilot training involves close working relationships with instructors and fellow students who may not be comfortable with gender integration. Unit cohesion and mutual trust are essential for safety and mission success, and anything that disrupts those relationships creates risks for everyone involved. It was the closest he could come to explicitly stating his belief that women didn't belong in combat aviation without violating equal opportunity policies that were increasingly enforced by higher headquarters. His concerns were shared by many instructors and senior officers who had grown up in a military culture that associated combat effectiveness with traditionally masculine characteristics. "I appreciate your concerns, sir," Matthews replied carefully. "But I believe that competence and dedication matter more than gender when it comes to flying military aircraft. I'm willing to prove myself through performance rather than asking for special consideration or accommodation." Harrison studied her response, looking for signs of the defensive reactions that he expected from candidates who might not be prepared for the realities of military aviation culture. Her composure was impressive, but he'd learned that interview performance didn't necessarily predict success under the stress of actual training. "Very well, Lieutenant. Your application will be reviewed along with all other candidates, and selection will be based on the needs of the Air Force and the potential for successful completion of training. You should expect a decision within 60 days. It was the same response she'd received 3 times before, delivered with the same professional courtesy that concealed institutional resistance to change. Matthews left the interview knowing that her qualifications would be compared not just to other candidates, but to preconceptions about women's suitability for military aviation that had little basis in objective assessment. 60 days later, the rejection letter arrived with the familiar language about competitive selection processes and the suggestion that she consider alternative career fields where her qualifications would be more appropriate. No specific deficiencies were identified, no areas for improvement were suggested, and no timeline was provided for future applications. But Matthews had made a decision during her years of rejection and waiting. If the Air Force wouldn't allow her to enter pilot training through normal channels, she would find another way to demonstrate her capabilities. She requested assignment to Randolph Air Force Base as a maintenance officer, a position that would place her in daily contact with the aircraft and training operations she hoped to join. Her maintenance assignment provided opportunities that most aspiring pilots never received. She worked closely with flight instructors, observed training missions from the ground, and gained intimate knowledge of aircraft systems and operations through hands-on maintenance experience. More importantly, she continued her civilian flight training, building experience in high-performance aircraft that exceeded the qualifications of many accepted pilot candidates. For 8 months, Matthews performed her maintenance duties with the same dedication she'd shown at the academy, earning respect from instructors and students who appreciated her technical knowledge and professional competence. She volunteered for additional responsibilities, worked extra hours to ensure aircraft availability for training missions, and demonstrated the kind of commitment that military organizations valued in their personnel. But she also spent every available hour studying flight manuals, observing training exercises, and practicing procedures that weren't part of her official duties. Her maintenance position provided access to aircraft technical information that most candidates never saw, giving her detailed understanding of systems and emergency procedures that would prove crucial when opportunity finally presented itself. The opportunity came on a Tuesday morning in November, when unseasonably warm weather and clear skies created perfect conditions for advanced training flights. Matthews was supervising maintenance operations on the flight line when the alert klaxon sounded, indicating an aircraft emergency that required immediate response from all available personnel. AT-38 Talon, the supersonic trainer used for advanced pilot instruction, had experienced engine failure during a training flight, carrying Colonel Harrison and a student pilot on an instrument training mission. The aircraft was returning to base under emergency conditions, with one engine shut down and hydraulic systems operating at reduced capacity. Emergency aircraft inbound, the tower announced over the base-wide communication system. All personnel clear the active runway and prepare for emergency landing procedures. Matthews joined the crowd of maintenance personnel, instructors, and students who gathered near the runway to observe the emergency landing. Emergency vehicles were positioned at strategic locations along the runway, while medical personnel prepared to respond if the landing resulted in injuries requiring immediate treatment. The T-38 appeared as a speck on the horizon, growing larger as it approached the runway on a straight-in approach that suggested the pilot was having difficulty controlling the aircraft. Even from a distance, Matthews could see that the airplane was flying differently, less smoothly than normal, with slight oscillations that indicated control problems beyond simple engine failure. As the aircraft drew closer, it became apparent that the situation was more serious than initially reported. The T-38 was descending too steeply and approaching too fast, suggesting that the pilot was having difficulty maintaining control with reduced hydraulic pressure. Emergency landing procedures required precise timing and coordination that could be compromised by system failures. Tower, this is Thunder 1. Colonel Harrison's voice crackled over the radio, audible to ground personnel monitoring emergency frequencies. We have multiple system failures and limited control authority. Request emergency vehicles standing by for possible runway overrun. The gravity of the situation became clear to everyone listening. A runway overrun at the speeds involved in T-38 operations could result in catastrophic damage to the aircraft and fatal injuries to the occupants. Emergency response procedures were designed to minimize such outcomes, but success depended on pilot skill and aircraft response that might be compromised by system failures. Matthews watched the approach with growing concern, her maintenance experience allowing her to recognize problems that might not be apparent to casual observers. The aircraft's approach angle was wrong. Its speed was excessive, and the pilot appeared to be fighting control inputs that weren't producing expected responses from the aircraft. As the T-38 crossed the runway threshold, it became obvious that the landing would not be successful. The aircraft touched down hard, bounced back into the air, and began veering toward the left side of the runway as the pilot struggled to maintain directional control with limited hydraulic assistance. "Go around, go around," the tower controller transmitted, recognizing that a successful landing was no longer possible and that the safest option was to climb away from the runway for another approach attempt. But the aircraft didn't respond to the go-around command. Instead of climbing away from the runway, the T-38 settled back toward the ground in a flat attitude that suggested complete loss of control authority. The student pilot had apparently frozen at the controls, overwhelmed by the emergency situation and unable to execute the procedures necessary for aircraft recovery. Matthews didn't hesitate. While other ground personnel stood watching in helpless fascination, she sprinted toward the runway where emergency vehicles were positioned. Her maintenance vehicle was equipped with radio equipment that would allow her to communicate directly with the aircraft, and her technical knowledge of T-38 systems might provide solutions that others couldn't offer. "Thunder 1. This is maintenance control," she transmitted as she reached her vehicle. "I'm reading multiple hydraulic system failures. Recommend switching to manual reversion flight controls and reducing approach speed to minimum controllable airspeed." "Maintenance control, we've tried manual reversion," Harrison's voice replied, strain evident despite his years of experience. "Student pilot is having difficulty with control inputs, and I'm unable to reach the controls from the back seat. We need immediate assistance, or we're going to impact the ground." The situation had deteriorated beyond standard emergency procedures. With the student pilot frozen at the controls and Colonel Harrison unable to take over aircraft control from the rear cockpit position, the T-38 was essentially flying itself toward an inevitable crash. Emergency vehicles were moving into position, but there was nothing ground personnel could do to prevent the accident from occurring. Matthews made a decision that would either save lives or end her military career. "Sir, I'm qualified on T-38 systems, and I have stick time in the aircraft," she transmitted, knowing that her next words would reveal unauthorized flight activity that violated numerous regulations. "If you can get the student pilot out of the front seat, I can take control and attempt landing." There was a moment of shocked silence on the radio as everyone processed what she'd just proposed. Ground personnel weren't authorized to fly military aircraft under any circumstances, and suggesting that she could pilot the aircraft implied capabilities that weren't documented in her official records. "Maintenance control, clarify your last transmission," Harrison replied, his voice carrying disbelief at what he thought he'd heard. "Sir, I've been building flight time in civilian T-38s through a private training program," Matthews explained rapidly as the aircraft continued its unstable approach. "I'm familiar with emergency procedures, and I'm qualified to attempt the landing if the student pilot can be moved." What she didn't say was that she'd been paying for civilian instruction in T-38 aircraft through a private company that provided advanced training to former military pilots and wealthy enthusiasts. The training had cost her most of her salary for the past 8 months, but it had given her experience in the aircraft that exceeded what many military students received during their formal training. "That's impossible," Harrison replied. "Civilian T-38 training doesn't exist. Sir, with respect, there are 3 companies in Texas that provide T-38 training using former military aircraft sold to private operators. I've logged over 40 hours in type, including emergency procedures and single-engine approaches." Her revelation sent shockwaves through the control tower and emergency response teams monitoring the frequency. No one had known that civilian T-38 training was available, and the idea that a maintenance officer had been receiving advanced flight instruction was unprecedented in anyone's experience. But the aircraft was running out of time and altitude, with impact becoming inevitable unless someone took control immediately. Harrison faced a choice between certain death from aircraft impact and the unknown risks of allowing an unauthorized pilot to attempt recovery. "Matthews, is that you?" Harrison asked, recognition dawning as he processed the voice and implications of her proposal. "Yes, sir. I'm qualified, and I'm ready to try." For several seconds, the only sound on the radio was the background noise of aircraft systems and wind as Harrison considered options that all involved significant risks. But one risk was certain death, while the other offered at least the possibility of survival. "How do we make the transfer?" he asked, accepting her offer despite the unprecedented nature of the situation. "Land the aircraft on the runway, even if it's a hard landing," Matthews instructed, already moving toward a position where she could reach the aircraft quickly. "Once you're on the ground, get the student out of the front cockpit and I'll get in. If the aircraft is still flyable, we'll attempt a second landing approach." It was an audacious plan that violated every protocol and regulation governing military aircraft operations. But it was also the only option available that offered any hope of preventing deaths that would otherwise be inevitable. The T-38 touched down hard on the runway, bounced twice, and finally settled onto the ground with smoke rising from the landing gear and tires. Harrison maintained just enough control to keep the aircraft on the runway surface as it slowed from landing speed, though the airplane veered sharply toward the runway edge before finally coming to a stop. Emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft immediately, while Matthews sprinted across the tarmac carrying her helmet and survival gear. The scene was chaotic, emergency responders preparing for possible fire, medical personnel ready to treat injuries, and ground personnel trying to understand what was happening. Harrison had already opened the rear canopy and was helping the student pilot out of the front cockpit when Matthews arrived. The young officer was conscious but clearly shaken by the emergency, his face pale and hands trembling from the stress of nearly losing control of a high-performance aircraft. "Are you sure about this?" Harrison asked as Matthews prepared to climb into the front cockpit. "Sir, that aircraft needs to be moved off the runway, and it's flyable with proper control inputs," she replied with confidence that surprised even her. "I can get it airborne and land it safely if the systems are still functional." Harrison looked at her for a moment, seeing not the maintenance officer who'd been denied pilot training, but someone who might have the skills necessary to save both their lives. "Get in. We'll find out what you're really made of." Matthews strapped herself into the ejection seat with the automatic precision that came from extensive training in the aircraft. Her civilian instruction had included detailed study of T-38 systems, emergency procedures, and flight characteristics that many military students never fully mastered. More importantly, she'd practiced these exact scenarios in simulators that replicated the stress and confusion of actual emergencies. "Systems check," she announced, beginning the rapid assessment that would determine whether the aircraft was capable of safe flight. "Hydraulic systems are degraded but functional for flight controls," Harrison reported from the rear cockpit. "Engines are operating normally, and we have adequate fuel for multiple approach attempts." "Copy. I'm ready for takeoff when tower clears us." The control tower had been monitoring their entire conversation, and the tower controller faced his own unprecedented decision about whether to authorize takeoff by someone whose qualifications were completely unknown. But with the runway blocked by a disabled aircraft and emergency vehicles, they needed to move the T-38 regardless of who was flying it. "Thunder 1, you're cleared for takeoff when ready. Emergency vehicles will clear the runway, and we'll have crash rescue standing by for your landing approach." Matthews advanced the throttles smoothly, feeling the familiar acceleration as the twin engines pushed the aircraft forward along the runway. The T-38 responded normally to her control inputs, suggesting that the hydraulic problems weren't severe enough to prevent normal flight operations. "Positive rate. Gear up," she called out as the aircraft lifted off the runway. "Gear coming up," Harrison confirmed, noting that her procedures and communication were flawless despite the stress of the situation. As they climbed away from the airfield, Matthews felt the confidence that came from flying an aircraft she knew intimately. Her civilian training had prepared her for exactly this kind of emergency, and her knowledge of T-38 systems was actually superior to what most military students possessed at this stage of their training. "How are you feeling about the approach?" Harrison asked as they established a traffic pattern for landing. Confident, sir. The aircraft is flying normally with reduced hydraulic pressure, and I've practiced single-engine and hydraulic failure approaches extensively. For the next 15 minutes, Matthews demonstrated flying skills that impressed even Harrison's experienced assessment. Her control of the aircraft was smooth and precise. Her communication was professional and accurate, and her approach to the emergency landing showed the kind of judgment that separated exceptional pilots from ordinary ones. The landing was textbook perfect, on speed, on centerline, with touchdown at exactly the planned point on the runway. The aircraft rolled out smoothly and taxied to the parking area without any indication of the system problems that had nearly caused a fatal accident 40 minutes earlier. As they shut down the engines and completed post-flight procedures, Harrison looked at Matthews with an expression she'd never seen before, genuine respect from someone whose opinion carried tremendous weight in the military aviation community. "Lieutenant Matthews," he said quietly, "that was some of the finest emergency flying I've witnessed in 25 years of military aviation." "Thank you, sir. I'm just glad we could bring the aircraft home safely. Where did you really learn to fly like that?" Matthews took a deep breath before answering, knowing that her response would determine her future in the Air Force. "Sir, I've been receiving advanced flight training through Civilian Aviation Training Services in San Antonio. They operate former military T-38s and provide instruction to pilots who want to maintain proficiency in high-performance aircraft." Harrison processed this information with growing understanding of her dedication and the lengths she'd gone to develop capabilities that the Air Force had refused to provide through official channels. "How much has that training cost you?" "Most of my salary for the past 8 months, sir. But it was worth it to develop skills that I knew would be valuable if I ever got the opportunity to use them." "And you did all of this while being repeatedly rejected for pilot training?" "Yes, sir. I believe that if I could demonstrate actual competence rather than just academic qualifications, someone might be willing to give me a chance." Harrison looked at her with the kind of reassessment that came when preconceptions were challenged by undeniable evidence. This wasn't the emotionally unstable female candidate he'd expected. This was someone who demonstrated exceptional dedication, superior flying skills, and the kind of judgment under pressure that he sought in all pilot candidates. "Lieutenant, I owe you an apology," he said finally. "I've been making assumptions about your capabilities based on prejudice rather than performance. What you did today required courage, skill, and judgment that many experienced pilots don't possess." Over the next 6 hours, Matthews found herself at the center of an investigation that would determine whether her unauthorized flight training constituted a violation of military regulations or demonstrated exceptional initiative that warranted recognition. Senior officers from throughout the command structure arrived to interview her, review the circumstances of the emergency, and assess the implications of her actions. Colonel Harrison provided detailed testimony about her performance during the emergency, emphasizing her technical knowledge, flying skills, and decision-making under pressure. The student pilot she'd replaced also testified, admitting that he'd been overwhelmed by the emergency and grateful that someone with superior skills had been available to take control. Emergency response personnel confirmed that the situation had been critical and that conventional emergency procedures would likely have resulted in fatalities. Ground maintenance personnel testified about her technical competence and professional dedication during her 8 months at Randolph Air Force Base. But the most significant testimony came from civilian flight instructors who confirmed that Matthews had completed advanced T-38 training that exceeded the qualifications of many military pilot candidates. Her civilian training records showed dedication and achievement that impressed even skeptical senior officers. The investigation concluded that her actions had been justified by the emergency circumstances and that her unauthorized flight training, while irregular, had prepared her to save lives when official military training was unavailable. Rather than facing discipline, she was commended for initiative and dedication that exemplified the best traditions of military service. 3 days later, Matthews received a phone call that would change her life forever. "Lieutenant Matthews, this is Colonel Peterson from Air Force Personnel Command in Washington. I'm calling to inform you that your pilot training application has been personally reviewed by the Chief of Staff of the Air Force." Matthews felt her heart racing as she processed the implications of his words. The Chief of Staff was the highest-ranking officer in the Air Force, someone whose decisions affected the entire service and whose personal attention to individual cases was extremely rare. The Chief of Staff has directed that you be immediately accepted into the next available pilot training class, with a notation in your records that your selection is based on demonstrated exceptional performance under emergency conditions. It was the opportunity she'd been pursuing for over 2 years, finally granted based on proven capability rather than bureaucratic evaluation. But the phone call wasn't finished. Additionally, Lieutenant, the Secretary of the Air Force has asked to meet with you personally to discuss your experience and recommendations for improving pilot selection processes. You're being temporarily assigned to Washington for a special project involving pilot training policy review. The meeting with the Secretary of the Air Force took place in the Pentagon, in an office where decisions were made that affected military aviation policy throughout the Department of Defense. Secretary Jennifer Williams was the first woman to hold the position, and she understood the challenges that Matthews had faced in pursuing her aviation career. Lieutenant Matthews, Secretary Williams said as they sat in her private office overlooking the Potomac River, your story has reached the highest levels of government, including the President's attention. He specifically asked me to ensure that the Air Force is doing everything possible to identify and develop talent regardless of gender or other irrelevant characteristics. The President's personal interest in her case reflected broader political changes regarding women's roles in the military, changes that were accelerating despite institutional resistance in some quarters. Her emergency flight performance had provided a compelling example of capability that transcended traditional assumptions about gender and military effectiveness. Additionally, Secretary Williams continued, Congress is considering legislation that would eliminate combat exclusion policies and open all military positions to qualified personnel regardless of gender. Your case has been cited as evidence that such policies may be preventing the military from utilizing its best personnel most effectively. Over the next hour, they discussed Matthews's experiences, the barriers she'd encountered, and recommendations for policy changes that would ensure future talented individuals wouldn't face similar obstacles. Her insights were incorporated into policy reviews that would eventually lead to fundamental changes in military personnel policies. 6 months later, Second Lieutenant Rebecca Matthews graduated from pilot training at the top of her class, earning recognition as the outstanding graduate in selection for advanced fighter training in F-16s. Her performance throughout the program validated every assessment of her capabilities and demonstrated that excellence in military aviation was determined by skill, dedication, and judgment rather than gender. More importantly, her emergency flight performance had become a case study used in pilot training programs to illustrate decision-making under pressure and the importance of thorough preparation for emergency situations. Instructors used her example to emphasize that exceptional performance required dedication that went beyond minimum requirements. Colonel Harrison, who had initially opposed her admission to pilot training, became one of her strongest advocates and requested assignment as her first squadron commander when she completed F-16 training. His assessment of her capabilities had changed completely based on observed performance, and he wanted the opportunity to continue developing what he now recognized as exceptional talent. Lieutenant Matthews, he said during her graduation ceremony, you've proven that prejudice and preconceptions have no place in professional military evaluation. Your dedication and performance represent the highest standards of military aviation, and you've earned your place among the best pilots in the Air Force. Years later, when the combat exclusion policies were finally eliminated and women were authorized to fly in all military aviation roles, Matthews's emergency flight performance was remembered as a pivotal moment that demonstrated capability and opened minds to possibilities that had previously been dismissed. Her story became part of military aviation history, told in classrooms and training programs as an example of how persistence and proven capability could overcome institutional barriers. But for her, the real satisfaction came from knowing that she'd earned her wings through demonstrated competence and that she'd proven worthy of the opportunities that others had initially denied. Because sometimes the person who saves everyone is the one nobody expected to fly. And sometimes the sky belongs to those who refuse to accept that it's off limits, proving their right to be their one perfect landing at a time.